There is a particular kind of quiet devastation that almost nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive with sirens or collapse. It arrives on an ordinary Tuesday, sometimes in the middle of a moment that should have felt like victory. You get the thing you worked for, the promotion, the relationship, the apartment with the light you wanted, the number in the bank account that an earlier version of you would have called security. And for a few days, maybe a few weeks, it works. You feel the lift. You notice yourself walking differently, breathing a little easier, believing for a moment that you've finally arrived somewhere stable. And then the strangest thing begins to happen. So gradually, you almost miss it. The thing you fought to get stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like the floor. Normal, expected, barely noticeable. And somewhere underneath that new normal, a familiar restlessness starts knocking again. Quiet at first, then louder, asking the same question it has asked after every single arrival you've ever experienced. Is this really it? If you've felt that, and then immediately felt guilty for feeling it, like there was something wrong with you for not being satisfied when you clearly should have been satisfied, I want you to hear this clearly. There is nothing broken in you. What you've been experiencing is not ingratitude or greed, or a failure to appreciate your life. It's a feature of the human operating system itself. Psychologists call it hedonic adaptation. The human brain, given any stable condition, good or bad, will eventually calibrate that condition as its new baseline and start scanning for the next problem to solve. It's not a bug. It's a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive when ignoring a rustling bush for too long could mean something ate them. But applied to modern life, where threats are more abstract and rewards are more plentiful, this same mechanism quietly transforms every achievement into just another starting block. You get the raise. 2 months later, your emotional thermostat has reset, and you're already wondering why you don't feel more secure. You get the relationship, and sooner or later the dizzy early feelings settle into routine, and some worried part of you mistakes the absence of constant intensity for the absence of love. You reach the milestone, whatever it was, and discover that the finish line has been quietly repainted farther down the track while you were busy crossing it. This is the quiet catastrophe of arrival. Not that you fail to get what you want, but that getting what you want doesn't end the wanting. And if you don't understand this mechanism, if you can't see it operating beneath the surface of your desires, you'll spend decades running faster and faster toward finish lines that cannot ever hold still. I want to be precise here, because the usual advice around this topic is almost insulting. Be grateful for what you have. Stop wanting more. Appreciate the present moment. True enough in principle and almost entirely useless when delivered as a command. You can't gratitude your way out of a neurological adaptation pattern any more than you can willpower your way out of hunger. The mechanism is deeper than conscious attitude. The Stoics, remarkably, understood this 2 millennia before researchers gave it a clinical name. They watched wealthy senators acquire estates and prestige and political power, and then watched those same senators grow restless and envious of the next person above them, completely incapable of enjoying what they'd already amassed. They watched celebrated generals return from conquests and sink into depression within months of peacetime. And they watched with particular attention the people who didn't fall into this trap, the ones who somehow stayed steady amid the same human cravings everyone else felt. What they noticed, and what forms the foundation of everything we're going to cover, is that the people who escaped this cycle didn't do it by wanting less or pretending not to want at all. They did it by shifting the entire location of where they looked for satisfaction. Not outward to the next acquisition, the next achievement, the next set of circumstances they hoped would finally hold still, but inward to the only domain where stability is even possible, the way they met their circumstances, not the circumstances themselves. This is not a small distinction. It's the difference between building a house on ground that shifts every season and building on ground that doesn't move. Most of us spend our lives building on the shifting ground. When the structure starts to crack, we assume we just haven't built enough yet. More money, more status, more distraction, more something. And the building keeps cracking, not because the design was wrong, but because the location can't support what we're trying to build. The Stoic insight is that genuine contentment, the kind that doesn't evaporate as soon as life gets difficult or boring, is not an emotion that arrives in response to good events. It's a capacity you build through daily practices that have almost nothing to do with the events themselves. Which means, and this is the part that should give you real hope, you don't need a different life to start feeling differently inside the one you already have. Two people can wake up in the same city, work the same job, face the same traffic, deal with the same difficult relatives, carry the same financial burdens, and have wildly different internal experiences of being alive. That gap between them is not luck, it's not circumstance. It's a set of specific, repeatable habits that one of them has quietly built into their days and the other hasn't. Habits that train the mind to stop looking for the next arrival and start inhabiting the only moment any of us ever actually possesses, which is this one. So the question that matters, the one beneath every goal you've ever set and every finish line you've ever crossed and found empty, is not what do I need to get next. It's what do I need to practice daily so that arriving stops being the point. The rest of what you're about to hear is the answer the Stoics spent their lives refining, and the answer modern psychology keeps accidentally rediscovering. It starts, strangely, with what you do before the day even begins. Not an hour of meditation, not a complicated ritual. 60 seconds that almost everyone hands away without realizing what they've given up. Those 60 seconds are not a metaphor. They are an actual window that opens every single morning between the moment you wake and the moment you first let the outside world in. And what almost nobody tells you, because it sounds too small to matter, is that what you do inside that tiny window sets the emotional trajectory of your entire day. Not magically, not mystically, but mechanically. Your nervous system, still swimming in the theta and alpha brainwave states of early waking, is extraordinarily receptive to its first inputs. The first thing you see, the first thing you hear, the first thought you deliberately think or passively absorb. It doesn't just inform your mood, it primes your entire attentional filter for the hours that follow. If the first thing you do is open your phone and absorb 15 strangers' opinions, 3 headlines designed to alarm you, 2 emails that aren't actually urgent, and a stream of other people's curated highlight reels before you've even stood up, you have handed the steering wheel of your emotional state to algorithms and acquaintances who do not know you and do not care about your well-being. You are reactive before you've had the chance to be intentional, and a day that begins reactively almost always continues reactively, because the initial posture of catching up, responding, and defending against incoming demands never naturally resolves itself into clarity. It just accelerates. Marcus Aurelius understood this, not because he was some enlightened sage who floated above ordinary human resistance, but precisely because he wasn't. By any external measure, he was the most powerful man in the Western world. Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, a man whose decisions affected millions of lives. And yet we know from his own private writing that most mornings of his adult life, he struggled to get out of bed. The same heaviness you feel on a Monday morning when the alarm goes off and the weight of everything you have to do settles onto your chest before you've even moved. The same internal negotiation between the part of you that knows you should rise and the part of you that wants to stay under the covers for 10 more minutes. The difference between Marcus Aurelius and most people wasn't that he had some superhuman motivation that bypassed this struggle. The difference was that he had a ritual, a deliberate moment before the demands of empire crashed down on him, where he decided who he was going to be that day. He sat down, often before sunrise, often exhausted, often reluctant, and he wrote to himself. We call those writings meditations now, though he never intended anyone else to read them. And one of the most famous passages is essentially a man talking himself into getting out of bed. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I am rising to do the work of a human being. Why should I be irritated at the world when I am going out to do what I was made for? Read that again, and notice what it actually is. It's not a triumphant declaration, it's an argument. He's persuading himself. The most powerful man in the known world had to consciously redirect his own attention away from the comfort of staying still and toward the purpose of the day ahead, because the pull of avoidance is not a sign of weakness. It's a universal feature of having a human brain. What separated him wasn't the absence of that pull. It was the daily practice of overriding it on purpose, before the chaos began. This is the heart of the morning habit that the calmest, most content people practice, and it has almost nothing to do with the elaborate routines that social media sells you. You do not need an hour of meditation, a cold plunge, a gratitude journal with prompts, a specific brand of coffee, and a sunrise yoga session. That version of morning practice is itself a kind of performance, and for most working people, especially parents, it's completely inaccessible, which means it becomes just another thing to feel inadequate about. The real practice is far simpler and far harder to avoid once you understand it. Before you touch your phone, before you check a single notification, before anyone else's voice enters your mind, you claim a small pocket of time that belongs only to you. For some people that's 10 minutes. For many it's 5. For almost everyone it can start with 60 seconds. 1 minute of silence. 1 cup of coffee consumed without scrolling. 1 short walk to the end of the driveway and back before checking messages. A single question asked internally, honestly, before the noise begins. Who do I want to be today, no matter what happens? Not what do I need to do today, not what problems am I about to face, but what posture, what quality of character, what version of myself am I choosing before circumstances start choosing for me? That question, asked before your brain has been flooded with external demands, does something neurologically significant. It activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for intentional decision-making and value-aligned action, before the amygdala has been triggered by whatever emergencies your inbox and newsfeed are about to present. You are establishing the executive function as the driver of your day, rather than the emergency response system. And that single shift, repeated daily, accumulates into something that feels over time like a completely different life. I understand the objection that rises here, because I've heard it from people I respect. I don't have time. My mornings are already chaos. My kids need me the second I open my eyes. My job starts demanding attention before I'm even dressed. And if that's genuinely true for you right now in this season of life, I'm not going to pretend it's easy. But I will ask you to be honest about whether it's actually true or whether it's a story that protects you from trying. Because protecting 60 seconds before the noise gets in is not a scheduling problem. It's a willpower problem. And willpower, unlike time, is something you can train. You wake up, your hand instinctively reaches for the phone on the nightstand. That reach is a habit, not a necessity. The world will survive for 1 more minute without your response. The emergencies that genuinely can't wait 60 seconds are almost non-existent. What's actually happening, if you're willing to look at it squarely, is that the phone has become a comfort object, and those first few minutes of scrolling are a way of numbing the brief discomfort of facing a new day, with all its uncertainty and demand. But numbing is not the same as preparing, and a day that begins with numbing almost always requires more numbing later to sustain it. Here is the small, practical version. Tomorrow morning, before your feet touch the floor, before your hand finds the phone, give yourself 60 actual seconds. Breathe. Ask the question, who do I want to be today? You don't need a perfect answer. You just need to ask before the noise starts. That's the practice. That's the entire practice. And if you do it, you will notice within days that something has shifted. You are no longer starting your day as a reader of everyone else's script. You are starting as the author of your own. But the morning is only the beginning, because once you've claimed that first posture, the day will immediately start delivering things you didn't choose. A frustrating comment, a delayed plan, a betrayal small or large. And what you do in that second moment, the moment when reality hands you something you never asked for, is where most people quietly fail, even when they know better. That second moment is the one that tests everything. You've claimed your morning. You've set your intention. You've decided, however quietly, who you want to be today. And then, before you've finished your coffee, something goes wrong. A curt message from someone you thought respected you. A plan that collapses at the last minute. A driver who cuts you off with a casualness that feels almost personal. Your child's meltdown over something impossibly small. A piece of news you didn't want. The world, indifferent to your morning intention, hands you a moment you never asked for. And in that moment, a split-second decision happens that most people don't even realize they're making. They either accept that the moment has arrived, or they begin arguing with it. That argument is the quietest and most expensive habit unhappy people share. It doesn't look like a tantrum, though it sometimes becomes one. More often it looks like internal replay, a loop that starts spinning the instant reality, deviates from expectation, and doesn't stop for minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes an entire day. The event itself, the thing that actually happened, lasts seconds. The internal argument with the fact that it happened lasts far longer and does far more damage. And here is the brutal truth at the center of this entire practice. Arguing with something that has already happened is a battle you cannot ever win. Reality does not negotiate. It doesn't care whether you think it should have been different. It doesn't adjust itself in response to the intensity of your frustration. What has happened, and no amount of mental replay, resentment, or indignant narration will unhappen it. The only thing your argument changes is your own internal state, which it reliably worsens. There is a story from the Stoic tradition that captures this principle more starkly than any abstract explanation. Epictetus, before he became one of history's great philosophical teachers, spent years of his early life enslaved. The details are hazy across 2 millennia, but one account has stayed lodged in the tradition. At some point, his leg was broken. Some sources say his master did it deliberately in an act of casual cruelty. Others describe an accident. Whatever the cause, the story holds that Epictetus did not respond with hysteria or rage. He reportedly observed what was happening with something approaching clinical calm, warning that continued force would break the limb entirely, and when it did break, simply noting that he had said as much. No collapse, no screaming at the injustice, no internal loop of why me, spinning for weeks afterward. Now, on first hearing, that response can sound cold to the point of inhumanity, and if that's where the story stopped, it would be a poor model for anyone trying to live a full emotional life. But the story isn't recommending emotional numbness. It's demonstrating something far more practical. Epictetus was not saying don't feel pain. He was saying don't add unnecessary suffering to unavoidable pain. The broken leg was the pain. That was real and unavoidable. The rage, the self-pity, the obsessive replay of the injustice, that would have been the suffering, and that part was optional. Not easy to opt out of, but optional. This is a distinction the Stoics returned to again and again, because they saw how many people around them were drowning in suffering that had almost nothing to do with their actual circumstances, and almost everything to do with their refusal to accept that those circumstances had occurred. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly, often in language that suggests he needed the reminder daily, because he did. He told himself that the obstacle in the path becomes the way forward. that whatever gets in the way of the action becomes the action itself. If rain cancels an outdoor plan, the rain is now part of the plan. If a trusted colleague betrays him, that betrayal is now the material he has to work with. He wasn't pretending to like what happened. He wasn't bypassing the sting of disappointment or hurt. He was refusing to add a second layer of suffering on top of the first, by fighting a battle that was already over. The rain has already fallen. The words have already been spoken. The decision has already been made. What remains? The only thing that has ever remained once an event has passed into the unchangeable past is the question of what you will do with the material you now hold. Think about the last time someone said something sharp to you. The comment itself took maybe 3 seconds. But if you're honest, how long did you carry it afterward? Replaying it in the car, narrating a better response you wish you'd delivered, imagining the conversation going differently, rehearsing the confrontation you'll have next time. The 3-second event became a 30-minute internal occupation, and during those 30 minutes, the person who made the comment was probably not thinking about you at all. They had moved on. You were the only one still in the room with the event, keeping it alive long after it had died on its own. The traffic didn't ruin your morning. Your argument with the traffic ruined your morning. The criticism didn't derail your day. Your obsessive replay of the criticism derailed your day. The disappointment didn't drain your energy. Your refusal to accept that the disappointment had happened drained your energy. The happiest people you will ever meet are not people to whom nothing bad happens. That person doesn't exist, and the expectation that they should is itself a source of constant low-grade resentment toward life. The happiest people are those who have trained themselves through repeated deliberate practice to ask a different question when something goes wrong. The default question, the one most of us reach for automatically because our culture reinforces it constantly, is some version of "why is this happening to me?" A question with no useful answer. A question that keeps you circling the drain of self-pity and resentment, narrating your victimhood in increasingly detailed terms, without moving you 1 inch closer to resolution. The alternative question, the one the Stoics practiced until it became instinct, is, given that this has happened, what is the most useful thing I can do right now? Not what should I have done, not whose fault is it, not how can I make them understand how wrong they were, but what now? That single shift from why me to what now reorients the entire mind. It moves you from the past, which is frozen and unchangeable, into the present, which is the only place action is possible. Here is a practical version for the week ahead. The next time something frustrating happens, a plan falls apart, someone lets you down, you lose something, you receive news you didn't want, give yourself explicit permission to feel it fully, for 60 seconds, not to suppress it. Stoicism has been badly misread as a philosophy of emotional suppression, but that's not what the texts actually describe. Feeling the initial sting is human. The goal is not to not feel. The goal is to not be ruled by the feeling for longer than it's useful. So feel it. Let the frustration or hurt or disappointment move through you for 1 honest minute. And then, at the end of that minute, ask the question, what now? You will be shocked by how much energy that question returns to you. Energy that would have otherwise leaked away into an argument with reality that reality was never going to lose. 2 people can experience the exact same unwelcome event. One spends the rest of the day inside the event, replaying it, narrating it, letting it color every interaction that follows. The other feels the sting, asks what now, and redirects their remaining energy toward whatever is actually still within their reach. Same event, completely different day. The difference isn't personality. It's a practiced habit of refusing to fight battles that are already over, which raises the obvious next question. If so much of our suffering comes from pouring energy into things we can't control, how do we know where the boundary actually sits? How do we tell the difference between what's ours to carry and what we've been carrying unnecessarily sometimes for years, without ever realizing we could put it down. The boundary is both simpler and harder than most people want it to be. Simpler, because the Stoics drew it with almost brutal clarity 2,000 years ago, and nothing about human nature has changed enough in the intervening millennia to blur the line. Harder, because actually living on the right side of that line, day after day, requires a kind of honesty most of us spend our lives avoiding. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the private pages that became Meditations, returned to this distinction so often that you can almost feel him gripping it like a handrail. He separated everything in human experience into two categories: the things that are up to us, our judgments, our efforts, our desires, our aversions, our own conduct, and the things that are not up to us, our body, our reputation, other people's opinions, the outcome of events we've already done our best on. That's the list. It hasn't changed. Your judgments are yours. Your effort is yours. How you treat people is yours. Everything else, and he meant everything, belongs to the second category. Not because it doesn't matter, but because pouring your emotional energy into it changes nothing except your own internal state, which it reliably worsens. Now, I know how that lands on first hearing. It can sound cold, even fatalistic. If I can't control the outcome, why try? If my reputation isn't up to me, why care what anyone thinks? If my body isn't fully mine to command, why bother taking care of it? But that reading misses the entire point, and the Stoics anticipated it. They weren't saying stop caring about outcomes. They were saying stop suffering over outcomes after your part is done. Pour everything you have into the part that's yours. Prepare relentlessly. Show up fully, act with integrity, and then, the moment your effort leaves your hands and enters the world where other people's choices, chance, and 1,000 unseen variables take over, release your grip, not because you don't care, because gripping tighter at that point doesn't improve the outcome, it just exhausts you. Think about an ordinary work presentation. You can control how thoroughly you prepare. You can control the clarity of your thinking, the quality of your practice, the effort you put into anticipating questions. You cannot control whether your boss is distracted by a personal crisis during your delivery. You cannot control whether a colleague takes credit for your idea afterward. You cannot control whether the client says yes or no, because the client's decision involves factors you will never see. If you've done the preparation, the outcome is no longer in your hands. And yet how many people, after delivering the best presentation they could possibly give, spend the next 3 days obsessively replaying it, worrying about the decision, refreshing their inbox, suffering over something that is literally not happening inside their control. That suffering is not productive. It doesn't influence the client. It doesn't impress the boss. It just occupies mental space that could have been used for the next thing that actually is up to you. The hidden cost of this pattern is staggering once you start tracking it. On any given day, a huge percentage of your mental energy goes toward things you cannot actually change. What a stranger online thinks of you, whether a particular person likes you, what might happen in the economy next year, whether someone from your past has moved on, whether your children will turn out okay in 20 years. These are all real concerns. Loving people means caring about them. Being a responsible adult means thinking about the future. But there is a crucial difference between caring and suffering. You can care deeply about your child's future and still recognize that you cannot control who they become. You can release your grip on the outcome without releasing your love. You can plan for the economy without obsessing over it, because obsessing doesn't change the economic forecast. It just makes you miserable in the present, while the future remains exactly as uncertain as it was before you started spiraling. Happy people, the genuinely steady ones, are not people who have stopped caring about these things. They're people who have gotten ruthlessly honest about where the boundary between caring and useless suffering actually sits. They still work hard. They still love deeply. They still show up fully for their responsibilities. But they've learned to release their grip on outcomes the moment their own effort ends. And that release, repeated across hundreds of small moments, saves them an enormous amount of energy that other people leak daily without ever noticing. There's a practice I want you to try this week that makes this boundary tangible. Every time you notice yourself spiraling, replaying a conversation, worrying about an outcome, obsessing over someone's opinion, ask one blunt question. Is this actually up to me right now in this moment? Not in general, not in theory, right now. If the answer is no, you're not being asked to stop caring. You're being asked to stop suffering over something your suffering cannot change. And then redirect that same energy toward the next thing that actually is up to you. That redirection, that simple pivot from useless worry to useful action, is one of the quietest but most powerful sources of peace a human being can build. I want to pause on a point that often gets lost when this idea is discussed, especially when the people we love are involved. Telling a parent to let go of worrying about their adult child's choices can sound heartless if you don't understand what the Stoics actually meant. They weren't saying stop loving people. Love people fully. Show up for them fully. Say the things that need saying. Offer the support you can offer. And then release your grip on what you cannot control about their choices. Because gripping tighter doesn't protect the people we love. It just exhausts you without changing their path even slightly. The letting go isn't about caring less. It's about suffering less for exactly the same amount of love. That distinction matters, and the people in your life can feel the difference between someone who shows up out of anxious control and someone who shows up out of steady, unclinging love. Once you start practicing this boundary, something else begins to shift. You stop being ambushed by difficulty because you've already made peace with the fact that difficulty will come. Which brings us to the final set of practices, the ones that turn all of this preparation into something that holds steady when life actually tests it. Because knowing where the boundary sits is one thing, staying on the right side of it when the stakes are high is another. And the Stoics had a way of preparing for that moment that sounds, on first hearing, like the opposite of everything we're told about positive thinking. That way of preparing has a Latin name that sounds intimidating, but describes something remarkably simple once you understand it. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of misfortunes. Before any journey, any venture, any new undertaking, they recommended spending a few minutes imagining what could go wrong, not to catastrophize, not to become anxious, not to dwell in morbid fixation, but to mentally rehearse difficulty so that if it actually arrives, it arrives at a mind that has already met it once before, at least in imagination, and decided how to handle it. On the surface, this sounds like the exact opposite of the relentless optimism our culture prescribes. We are told to visualize success, to speak abundance into existence, to refuse to even think about negative outcomes for fear of attracting them. And yet, modern psychology has independently arrived at something remarkably close to the Stoic practice. Researchers call it defensive pessimism, or in athletic and business circles, mental contrasting. And the studies consistently find that people who briefly rehearse obstacles before pursuing a goal tend to perform better and report less anxiety than people who only visualize success. Why would imagining bad outcomes make someone happier, not more anxious? Because most anxiety isn't caused by difficulty itself. It's caused by difficulty arriving unrehearsed, catching us in a state of denial that this could ever happen to us. When the traffic jam appears and you're already 15 minutes late, the person who never once considered "what if I hit traffic" experiences pure blindsided panic. The person who spent 30 seconds that morning thinking traffic might happen, and if it does, I'll call ahead and let them know, experiences a moment of mild inconvenience. Some part of their mind already lived this scenario and already decided how to handle it. The rehearsal robs the difficulty of its power to shock. And shock, far more than difficulty itself, is what destabilizes us. Marcus Aurelius practiced this daily as a form of armor. He would remind himself each morning that today he might encounter the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious. People behaving exactly as difficult people always behave. Not to expect the worst from everyone he met, but so that if it happened, he wouldn't be shocked into anger by behavior that is, frankly, an ordinary part of being human among other humans. He was not a pessimist. He was a man who understood that unprepared optimism is brittle, and that the smallest unanticipated disappointment can shatter it, while prepared steadiness can absorb difficulty without breaking. He'd wear his roughest clothing, eat the simplest, cheapest food, sleep on a hard, plain bed, all while having the means to live in total luxury just steps away. He described doing this specifically so that if fortune ever did take his wealth away, he would already know from direct experience that he could survive it without falling apart. He wanted to test on his own terms whether poverty was actually the terrifying thing he feared it might be, and he discovered, again and again, that it wasn't nearly as bad as the fear of it. This is the ancient root of something you might recognize from modern life without knowing its origins. Voluntary discomfort, cold showers, fasting, deliberately difficult workouts, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, sitting in silence without your phone for an hour. The happiest people build this into their lives, not because they enjoy suffering, but because comfort in unlimited doses quietly makes people fragile. If your nervous system has never once practiced tolerating an uncomfortable sensation, genuine hunger, genuine cold, genuine effort, then the first time real hardship arrives uninvited, it hits a mind and body that has never once practiced staying calm under discomfort. But if you voluntarily sat with discomfort on your own terms, at a time and intensity you chose, you build something like an emotional callus, not numbness, resilience. And then there is the final practice, the one that ties everything together and gives the entire Stoic framework its particular urgency. Memento mori, remember that you will die. Roman generals, according to tradition, would have a servant walk behind them during victory parades, whispering some version of remember, you are mortal. Even during their greatest moments of triumph, when it would have been easiest to believe they were invincible, the reminder was there. Marcus Aurelius returns to this idea constantly throughout meditations, reminding himself again and again that he could leave this life right now, and that this thought, rather than being a source of dread, should shape every choice he makes about what he says, does, and thinks in whatever time remains. This belongs on a list about happiness, because almost everything that steals our happiness depends on a hidden assumption we rarely examine. The grudges we won't let go of, the arguments we keep alive out of pride, the hours spent scrolling, the years spent postponing the conversation we actually need to have, the apology, the phone call, the I love you we keep meaning to say. All of it assumes that there will always be time to say it later. The moment you genuinely sit with the fact that your time is not unlimited, not in a morbid, paralyzing way, but in a clarifying way, your priorities reorganize themselves almost instantly. The grudge suddenly looks smaller. The argument suddenly looks like a poor use of a limited resource. The phone call you've been putting off suddenly looks urgent in a way it didn't 5 minutes ago. This isn't about being obsessed with death. It's about using the fact of death, the one certainty every single human being shares regardless of wealth, power, or circumstance, as a filter for what actually deserves your limited hours. I want to bring all of this together with a single story, because stories are how human beings actually remember things, and this one contains everything we've covered. In the year 175 AD, word reached Marcus Aurelius that one of his own generals, a man named Avidius Cassius, had declared himself emperor and rebelled against him. A betrayal from someone he trusted, in the middle of a war, at a time when Marcus was already exhausted, already grieving, already stretched past what any reasonable person should be asked to carry. By every account, this was one of the darkest moments of his reign. And what did he do? Historical accounts describe him marching toward the confrontation, not with vengeance in his heart, but reportedly saying he hoped to have the chance to show the traitor mercy rather than punishment, that he wished he could resolve it by winning the man over, not by destroying him. Before the two armies could meet, Cassius was killed by his own soldiers. And when his head was brought to Marcus as what was assumed would be a welcome trophy, tradition holds that Marcus refused to celebrate it and reportedly ordered it buried with proper honors instead of displayed. A man betrayed at the worst possible time, with every justification in the world to want revenge, chose mercy. Not because he was weak, not because he didn't feel the sting, but because he had spent years training himself in exactly the practices we've walked through. The morning reflection that reminded him who he wanted to be, the refusal to argue with what had already happened, the discipline of controlling only what was his to control, the nightly honesty, the rehearsal of hardship, the voluntary discomfort that had already taught him he could survive worse than this, the constant quiet awareness that none of it, his power, his empire, his enemies, his own life, would last forever. That is not a man who got lucky with a peaceful temperament. That is a man who built peace, brick by brick, through small habits practiced on ordinary days, so that on the worst day of his reign, peace was simply what showed up because it was already there. You are not going to face a military rebellion this week, but you will face something, a frustration, a disappointment, a betrayal small or large, a moment where the old version of you would have spiraled, and in that moment, the only thing standing between you and peace will be whether you've built the habit beforehand or whether you're trying to invent it for the first time under pressure. So here is where we land. The calmest, most content people on earth are not happier because life was easier on them. Marcus Aurelius buried multiple children and led Rome through a devastating plague. Seneca was exiled and later forced to end his own life. Epictetus began his life enslaved, his body permanently damaged. None of them had an easy path. All of them found peace anyway. They found it in small, repeatable, almost boring daily habits, claiming the first minutes of the day before the world claims them, refusing to argue with a reality that has already happened, narrowing their concern to only what's actually within their control, rehearsing hardship before it arrives so it never catches them unprepared, choosing discomfort on purpose so real hardship never breaks them, and remembering, without fear, that their time is finite, and letting that single fact clarify everything else. None of these habits require money. None of them require permission. None of them require your circumstances to change even slightly before you can begin. That's exactly what makes them so powerful. You don't need to adopt all of them tomorrow morning. Pick one, just one. The one that made you pause somewhere in the course of what you've just heard. Practice that single habit for the next 7 days deliberately and on purpose. Notice what shifts. Because you don't need better circumstances to build a better life. You need better habits. Start with one today,